Hello, Lauren Fritsch here, and this is another video in my series on mental health and entrepreneurship. Today, I want to talk about the numbers because I think when we have some concrete data, we can then bring new perspectives to how we deal with that within the context of real life. So I have some numbers here with me. Some of these stats come from my friend on Facebook. She's called Briar Harvey. She's super awesome and she works with neurodivergent entrepreneurs on systems. So shout out Briar. Here we go, because these are insane. Number one, 72%, that's almost 3/4 of entrepreneurs are apparently neurodivergent. Now, when I saw that number, I was like, hold up, what? And it turns out that in the general population, about 20% of the general pop is neurodivergent. So that means, and I'm going to talk about why that happens, that means that entrepreneurs are neurodivergence is way overrepresented in entrepreneurs. Fascinating. Apparently, 32% of entrepreneurs have more than one diagnosis. 30% apparently have chronic depression. 29% ADHD, 27% anxiety, and I went and looked at the stats for the general population, it's about 18%, and 3 to 5% are autistic. So I find those numbers fascinating. Obviously, people with mental health challenges are overrepresented in entrepreneurship. I think there are a lot of reasons for that. I'm going to discuss that a little bit more, but I want to just also give you a little bit of my experience with stats in mental health in general. So I did an undergraduate research fellowship in psychology. I had a research partner and we created a tool to assess the disordered eating and eating disorder behavior of women at our university, the University of Virginia, amongst the undergraduate population. And we had to get it approved by the ERB. It was a very official thing. We sent out mail. We mailed out our survey, and we got a really massive response. So we were surprised by how many people actually participated, first of all, in something that at the time, so this is 20 years ago, they were willing to give us information about something that's very personal and often shameful. And a shocking number of women experienced eating disordered behavior, eating disorders, and then depression. And we're talking the number of women who experienced eating disordered behavior, so they couldn't classify it according to the DSM with eating disorders, was over half of the population. It was some ungodly number. And then over 40%, I want to say, because it's been 20 years, had experienced depression, what they would classify as depression. And so I say that because the University of Virginia is a hotbed of pressure and high achieving people. In general, entrepreneurs have a very similar mindset. They put a lot of pressure on themselves to achieve something. And so when it comes to the why are entrepreneurs struggling with mental health at a rate that is far outpacing the general population? First of all, let's talk more about it. Discovering some of these stats made it even more important that I continue on this trajectory. But why is this happening and what can we do about it? So first of all, I want to speak to the concept of neurodivergence, because if you are not familiar with that word, if 3/4 of entrepreneurs are neurodivergent, it doesn't necessarily mean that 3/4 of entrepreneurs are on the autism spectrum or have Asperger's or have a mental health challenge or ADHD, for example. Giftedness also classifies someone as neurodivergent. And I suspect that is a huge part of the population of entrepreneurs, is that they have a natural giftedness. So because of that innate giftedness, as well as whatever other diagnoses they might be experiencing, I suspect that people are drawn to entrepreneurship because they can create a container that can fit their skill set, their natural gifts, and the way that their brains work. Now, I could not have articulated that for myself when I was, graduating from college and moving into the quote unquote real world. But I knew fundamentally that even though someone who had the grades that I had and the experience that I had, I knew that going into the typical workplace, the highly coveted jobs was not going to be for me. So what were those jobs at the time? This was 2003, investment banking or consulting. Like you would go work for one of the big investment banks or you go work for one of the big three consulting firms. And I had a hard no on those kinds of jobs. Why is that? It's because I intuitively knew, even though I could not have articulated it, that those settings would have been detrimental to my growth and development in a positive way. I'm just not cut out for that. And so I took a different path, a very different path. So I think a lot of people who are neurodivergent, who end up as entrepreneurs, do so because they want to create a container where they can exist and thrive, as opposed to have to shoehorn themselves into someone else's very rigid container. And it turns out I had a roommate who, she's a professor of entrepreneurship now. Oh God, we should have a discussion about this stuff. But she's done some really interesting research when it comes to women entrepreneurs and debt. So fascinating. And she went to investment banking, and this woman worked insane hours. And that was just a pace that I knew that I would not be able to keep up with. And so I was glad, like I was like, dang, I wish I was making that kind of money. But I was also very glad that I didn't have that kind of pressure. So I do think that that's one of the reasons that people who are neurodivergent tend to move into entrepreneurship. Another reason is that if you have worked in a toxic workplace, you do not want to stay there if you have any self-preservation instincts. And unfortunately, I would say it's more the norm as opposed to the exception that workplaces are toxic. And if you've watched any of my videos, you've heard me say that all people are dysfunctional, and companies are as dysfunctional and more so than their people. And the bigger a company gets, their J curve for dysfunction increases exponentially. And so if you're in a toxic work environment, you are going to have some self-preservation instincts, and you're going to want to get out and create something that will support you, but without having to operate within that toxic workplace. And I think that is going to be coming into play more and more and more as we get post-COVID and people realize, oh, I don't actually want to be back in the office because I don't need all that. So companies are going to have to tease out the toxicity or lose a lot of their star people, because they're going to be unwilling to continue on. Now, so that's an impetus for people who are already neurodivergent or might already have mental health challenges to move into entrepreneurship. I also think that entrepreneurship can create extra pressures that make it more likely for people to have mental health challenges. So let's talk about that. So entrepreneurship can create conditions that can agitate mental health. Why is that? There's a couple reasons. One is isolation. A lot of entrepreneurs feel like they are in isolation. There aren't a lot of people that can relate to them. That is obviously changing, but for sure that's still the case. Number two is financial pressure. When you feel the pressure to generate revenue and you're the only one shouldering that burden, that can create some mental health challenges. A third reason is that when you feel that increased pressure, you can often relegate your self-care and the maintenance that's required to keep you healthy. You can relegate that to a back burner and even ignore it completely, to the point where your entrepreneurship becomes degenerative and can cause more problems than it's solving. The other thing is that we have this cultural interpretation of entrepreneurship that elevates certain entrepreneurs to almost mythic hero status, a really grand pedestal, right? That is a lot of pressure. And because we have that, it means that some entrepreneurs feel compelled to maintain that myth of perfection and sort of grandiosity. And that can be really detrimental to a sense of self and consequently to one's own mental health. So look, there's a combination in play here. We have people who are already maybe challenged with mental health choosing entrepreneurship because it's a path that can suit them better. And then some of the circumstances of entrepreneurship making it harder to stay well. So I think that's some of what's happening. And all of those factors combined, they reduce the likelihood that someone's going to reach out and ask for help. If you're isolated, if you have this like mythic stature and a cultural conditioning around, you know, the epic entrepreneur. Also, and this has happened recently, and I hesitate to talk about it, and maybe I will talk about it at a later point, but there was a very public death of an entrepreneur who was much beloved, and he was surrounded by a lot of sycophants, frankly, who weren't pushing back on him when he was making choices that were not healthy, and he lost his life. And I don't think that would have happened if people had really pushed back on him many years earlier also. That whole mythic stature also creates such isolation that it can be hard for other people to have empathy for you as the entrepreneur, and then it can be hard for the entrepreneur to have empathy for others. And so we get this sort of interesting conundrum of a whole class of entrepreneurs who don't have support, who aren't asking for help, who are increasing the pressures on themselves to perform and to deliver for stakeholders, and then inadvertently creating toxic workplaces, right? So it's this very interesting it's an interesting cycle that I think can take place if we are not very conscious about the decisions we make, very conscious about how our own trauma and mental health challenges inform the systems that we create around us. And it's so easy to say, oh, reject whatever is the thing that you don't want to be part of. So let's say corporate America, and then go recreate it in a smaller scale and call it entrepreneurship, right? Like that happens. It's the same concept of, you know, having a dysfunctional relationship, being like, I don't want that anymore. And then the next relationship has so many of the same beats, right? It takes profound self-awareness, energy, strength, and support to break those cycles. Whether you're in a workplace or you're an entrepreneur. But because entrepreneurs statistically are experiencing neurodivergence and mental health challenges at a much higher rate than the general population, I think we, as leaders, as entrepreneurs, we have got to start talking about this. How do we care for ourselves? How do we care for one another? How do we care for the systems that we create? If you like, you can watch my video on healing trauma is an act of leadership. And I will continue to be discussing what we as entrepreneurs can do to support our own mental health as we grow the businesses that we are growing so that we can change the world that we live in. Thank you so much. Peace.